I'm just going to get started and offer a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you all for joining us for our very first Ask Me Anything session. And we are really excited that you have decided to take some time to be with us today to hear from Rachel. So I just want to quickly do some introductions. This event is sponsored by Penn T-Cell East. We are a membership-based nonprofit association. We're a professional association, an affiliate of T-Cell International. And this event specifically is hosted by our advocacy committee. So in addition to offering professional development opportunities for ESL educators, we also are very involved in advocacy and support of English language teachers and learners. So I'm just going to invite those of you who are on camera to say hello. So I'm Valerie, I'm the advocacy committee. Rob,
Hey, I'm Rob, current president of Penn T-Cell East and member of the advocacy committee.
thanks, Rob. And we also have, do we have anybody else here right now? Nirva is here. Nirva, I know that you're kind of multitasking right now, so say hello for you. And we have a few other folks joining us, but we're so happy that you're all with us today. I do just want to mention one quick thing before we get started. We have an event coming up, an in-person event. Our spring symposium is on Saturday, May 30th. It's just a half-day event, and we're hosting it at the Welcoming Center in Center City, Philadelphia. So I'm going to invite Rob to put that information in the chat if you want to check it out. We'd love to have you with us. It's specifically geared towards English language teachers, but anyone else who's affiliated as well is welcome to come. So there's info there. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our special guest today, Rachel Rutter. So, if you saw the invitation, you saw her bio. There's actually a lot that we could say about Rachel, but I'm going to give you the shortened version. So, Rachel Rutter is an immigration attorney and is the founder and executive director of Project Libertad, which is a nonprofit organization based in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. And Project Libertad provides free legal and wraparound services for newcomer immigrant youth. Rachel was named a top 5 CNN hero and a WHYY Good Souls honoree. We got to say those things, Rachel, because they're really impressive, for her leadership in supporting vulnerable communities. And she also served in the Peace Corps in Costa Rica a few years ago and was an Equal Justice Works Justice AmeriCorps Fellow at Highest, Pennsylvania. And that is where we met when I was at Highest, PA. So I'm so happy that Rachel's with us today. She provided a session for us at our in-person conference last fall, and it was standing room only. And so we thought we'd invite her back to be able to offer a space for her to share information with more people. And we also recognize that the landscape has changed dramatically, even in just the last 6 months since we gathered in person in this field. So I'm just going to get us started, Rachel, with a general opening question, if that's okay.
Sounds great. Thank you for having us.
Great.
Excited to be
Yeah.
here.
And I'm going to ask if you have questions that come up. I know some folks did email questions ahead of time. Please, you can go ahead and just kind of write your question down, or you're welcome to submit it in the chat. We will kind of log those. And then after we move through these starter questions, we'll invite folks to ask their questions, kind of either call on you from those that we see in the chat or invite folks to unmute. Okay, so go ahead and feel free to use the chat in that way. All right, so Rachel, a lot has happened and changed in our immigrant communities and with immigration enforcement since the current administration took office in early 2025. And there's been even more upheaval, again, since you last spoke with us at our fall conference. So, can you just kind of walk us through the key changes over the last year and a half that have affected the immigrants we know in our communities in their daily lives, and also that have affected the way legal advocates like yourself have been able to support folks?
Yes. So one of the biggest changes has been the number of people in immigration detention, as well as the amount of people who are being detained who don't have any type of criminal record or kind of any reason to be prioritized for detention. So we've seen huge increases in the amount of people detained. I think the last count that I saw was around 70,000 people in immigration detention, which was an all-time record. That includes over 6,000 children that have been detained since January 2025. And we're seeing increases also in kids being detained with their families in an adult jail-like setting. So family detention had sort of gone away for a while, and has now been brought back. You've probably been hearing a lot about like the Dilley Detention Center in Texas on the news recently. So we're seeing, the revival of family detention. So just huge increases in enforcement. And I think in the beginning we were seeing sort of a lot of bluster and like headlines and really aggressive tactics. And I think there's a danger that people may think that it has gone away or is going back to normal, even though, like, as immigration advocates, I think we would all say that even normal, like, pre this administration, wasn't a good or humane situation. But I think that what has happened, and what Mark Wayne Mullen has said, who was Christine Noem's replacement, is that they want to get ICE and DHS out of the headlines, but they're not really backing down from their goal of mass deportation. So I think that they've changed their tactics and they're kind of being sneakier. So you may not be seeing as much of this on the news anymore, but it is still very much happening in the same numbers.
So, increase in detention.
Yes.
Lots of stuff in the headlines, obviously, around everything going on in Minnesota and other specific stories, but it doesn't mean that if it's not making headlines day to day, that it's still not happening at the same rate. What about, so there's fear around detention. What about changes in the way attorneys like yourself and other legal advocates have experienced in the ways that you're able to support people in these situations?
Yeah, so it's a lot different and worse even than like Trump 1.0 was. I kind of thought I knew what to expect having lived through that, but it's actually a lot worse this time than even what we anticipated. So for one thing, with the increase in detention, like it used to be pretty easy as an attorney to be like, I either do detained work or I don't do it, and you could kind of have like your niche. And now I think everybody has to learn about doing detained work because everybody's clients are kind of um, potentially going to be detained. So that's a big change, just kind of worrying about that, trying to keep on top of lots of different not only law, but also internal policy changes that are happening every day. It's just a lot to keep up with. Even in, I kind of do one very specific area of immigration, working with unaccompanied kids. And even like within that, it's a lot to keep up with all of the different changes that are happening and to actually know like what the law is and, from day to day and how that impacts my clients. Even as an example, they've recently started charging asylum seekers to apply for asylum and also to kind of keep their application open while it's waiting in this like years long backlog. And even that is like a big administrative burden for an organization like ours to keep track of like who has paid the fee? Have they reimbursed us for the fee? Can they reimburse us for the fee? Like and it's just, as everything with USCIS and immigration is very inefficient. Like you enter in the information to if you're paying by credit card, everything's in English. You have to pay by credit card, so it's really hard for our clients to like go and do this themselves. So it's something that we've like started doing for them. And then for those who are able to reimburse the fee, we ask them to, and if not, we just cover it. But just keeping track of like, did I pay this person's fee or not? Because USCIS also like doesn't give you a receipt when you pay it, you get a receipt mailed to you later, which makes no sense. And if you know anything about USCS, they're not very reliable. So wouldn't necessarily want to trust like their record keeping. So that's one big change, just like keeping up with all types of policy and legal changes, and then like how that impacts your day to day like burden of how much work you have to do. Clients being very afraid, even things that I used to do normally, like having kids go to fingerprint appointments or going to an asylum interview, where we knew what to expect. You can't really guarantee people anything anymore in terms of if ICE will be there, like waiting to detain them. And we've also just seen a much bigger need in the community for support with like basic needs like food, housing, those types of things, legal fees, as more and more people are being detained, and then families are kind of left to deal with that. So we've responded to that with like a volunteer team to try to help address some of those needs and like what people need to know when someone is detained. But then again, that's kind of like additional to like the stuff we already were doing. Um, so it's a lot to balance, and I think everyone's pretty maxed out and tired and just trying to stay afloat.
Rachel, you mentioned just how rapidly everything is changing and how tough it is to stay on top of things as they change, especially like things that we thought we knew we don't know so much anymore. Um, for your average person who just wants to be informed as an ally, maybe works in the field, do you have resources that we should be following, especially for more locally relevant updates that are reliable in terms of policy and enforcement?
Yeah, so I mean, we try to always post like on our social media and website updates to policy that impact youth specifically. So definitely follow along with us. One of my favorite resources is a Syracuse University researcher named Austin Coker. It's Austin Kocher. He's not necessarily local here, but he does a really, really good job of breaking down data and explaining. Thank you, Val. And it's Coker with a K. Um, so he's one of my favorites, and he's one of the only like journalists or writer that I feel like actually understands immigration and is not an immigration lawyer. It's really complicated, and he's really good at explaining things in like a very nonpartisan, like easy to understand way. So he's one of my go-to resources. In terms of like learning about local ICE enforcement, there's a lot of local like rapid response groups that have popped up. And we're in mostly Montgomery County, and we have Community for Change and Montco Community Watch that do a lot of really good work posting about ICE activity and people who've been detained. And then in Phoenixville, we have a rapid response group as well. Thank you for adding that. Yeah, his Substack, I would definitely subscribe to that. He will keep you very up to date. Yeah, those are some of my favorite resources. In terms of like know your rights materials for like your families and things like that, we also have like a legal help tab on our website that has a lot of templates and resources that you can share directly with families that are in multiple languages.
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. And we'll make sure to, continue to share those resources. So I want to go back to some more general questions, but speaking of know your rights, I think this is a question that many of us have. So initially, for those of us who have been working with folks in immigrant communities for a long time, we've always encouraged folks to know their rights. We've always relied on those resources as kind of a useful tool for people. We have seen in the last year and a half those rights violated constantly. And so I guess our question is with these constant examples of rights not being respected and constantly being violated, what can we do, some of us as educators, others as allies, and other folks in the community when it comes to encouraging folks to know their rights? How can we kind of still rely on that as a useful, proactive thing to do?
I definitely understand the frustration there, and it can kind of be like doesn't matter, does anybody have any rights anymore? Um, but I do still think that trying to exercise and preserve your rights is worth protecting, and still worth doing. Because for one thing, if we all just say like, okay, we accept that we don't have any rights, then I think that takes us to a dark place and is a slippery slope. But also it can still be a really important part of your defense. So we've seen situations where there were witnesses who were recording footage and then that contradicted like an ICE agent's account of an arrest and later kind of indicated that person. We've seen that with like how they try to attack protesters by like prosecuting them criminally and things like that. And we've also seen it in terms of like arresting immigrants. And that can be used as a part of that person's defense, whether they're a protester who's being targeted by the administration or an immigrant who, they allege tried to hit them with their car or like whatever, the stories that they always like to say. There have been a bunch of instances of like bystanders recording things that have later come out in court and worked in favor of the immigrant or the protester or whatever it was. So I also think in terms of immigration, like if ICE enters your house without a warrant, if they conduct a warrantless arrest, like groups like the ACLU are doing really good work on this. Like I know they're working on a case right now about warrantless arrests in PA. So like there's always these big like impact orgs that are doing that type of litigation to try to get decisions that impact a lot more people. So by preserving those things and documenting them, that's really helpful. It also, on an individual level, can make a difference in your case. So I don't know if this is in the questions later, so stop me if it is. But you've probably heard that ICE has severely limited like who can qualify for bond, which used to be a lot of people. And now they've really limited who they say can qualify for bond. And there's a circuit court split on that right now. So it may end up going to the Supreme Court to decide whether they can indefinitely detain all people without immigration status. Thanks, Val. Um, but one way that people have been getting out of detention is through habeas petitions, which is basically an individual suing the federal government and saying, I think my detention is unlawful. Um, and that's when, documenting the ways that ICE violated your rights is really important to show why your detention was unlawful. And we have, especially in Philly, seen people getting out fairly quickly on habeas petitions through the work that like defenders and Lila Thompson and all of those people are doing. So, still very important, even though it may not stop something from happening in the moment, it can still be a really vital part of your defense after the fact.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important message for us. Yeah, to still trust in that and still have some trust in the system. So I put a link in there for the Know Your Rights info from the ACLU. I think that's a source that you've cited, Rachel. So for those of you, I know that there are lots of different formats and of information that's been shared for Know Your Rights that folks have access to. But if anyone else has a good, reliable source, please feel free to share in the chat. And I see a question there. John will log your question for sure. So I just want to go back a little more generally. Let's talk a little bit broader about rights that members of our immigrant communities have. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of access that immigrants have to social services and welfare and those kinds of supports in regard to their immigration status and kind of break it down for us?
Yes. So, am I muted? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Mhm.
Okay, so I will preface this by saying that this is not necessarily my area of expertise, but I have a coworker who is good at this, so I'm pulling from information that she has given me. In general, undocumented people are not eligible for federal public benefits. The exceptions to that are WIC, and emergency medical assistance. Kids are also eligible for free or reduced price school lunches, regardless of immigration status. Um, and programs like domestic violence shelters and local programs like that wouldn't or shouldn't have policies discriminating based on immigration status. However, because of the One Big Beautiful Bill, we might see some changes to what protections or what services are available to people starting around October. Um, Within Pennsylvania, there are certain benefits that you can access at the state level if you have certain types of immigration status in process. So, for example, if you have an asylum claim pending, you may qualify for medical assistance, which is basically health coverage, if you meet the income qualifications and all of that. But in general, if you're just undocumented, you wouldn't qualify for anything like that. Um, and kids, regardless of immigration status, do have the right to public education, K through 12, regardless of immigration status. Um, I think that's as deep as I'm going to
Cool.
go, because other than that, I'm going to be
I think
like
that
the
covers
data
it.
side of what I know.
Yeah, I think generally, question on here, right, about what rights undocumented children have to a K to 12 education, clarifying that yes, they absolutely do, and that it's a really, really, really small subset of social services that are available to undocumented folks. So that's helpful. Um, so kind of going back to some of like the proactive support that folks can provide and thinking, building on kind of the know your rights conversation. What kind of practical plans can we share with our students and others in our community in the event that they get detained or separated from their families? In addition to knowing their rights, what are some other kind of key points of information in terms of planning that we should encourage?
So I would encourage anybody who hasn't actually spoken to an immigration lawyer and confirm that they don't have any options to do that, because having or applying for status is still kind of the number one thing you can do to protect yourself. I do tend to think that if you have a strong application for some type of immigration relief, that even though there is some risk to that, it's still riskier to remain undocumented when you could have something at least in process. So definitely talking to a trustworthy immigration lawyer would be number one. Um, I know I don't know how like in the weeds teachers will get about this, but like if it's possible, encourage each person in the family to be like individually screened. Because I find that I see a lot of like an attorney will take an asylum case for like a family unit that came into the US together, but they're not like individually screening the children for relief. And they're oftentimes things that the kids might qualify for that their parents don't qualify for. And so they can be leaving things on the table if you're not getting an individual screening for each person. Again, knowing your rights and then having an emergency plan in place for what will happen if someone gets detained or deported. So a lot of the challenges that we see families dealing with after someone's detained are obviously economic, right? Because you're losing either the breadwinner or like part of your income. So knowing what resources are available in your community in terms of like food banks and things like that, having copies of immigration documents, if there was a criminal case, criminal documents, um, identification documents, medical records, having all the important documents kind of ready to go and copies with a trusted friend, in the event that this happens so that you're not like scrambling to get records that you don't have access to or whatever, in the moment. Um, what else? We have like whole templates for this on our website, also under that legal tab that you can literally, sh it's like fill in the blank. I think it was put out by like Juntos at one point where you can fill in the blanks with all the important information. Another one, if they have young children, like planning for adding people to the like who's allowed to pick the kids up from school, like that type of permission at school, consulting with a custody attorney. If there's a concern over who will be able to take care of the kids if a parent is detained or deported. Um, I'm not a custody attorney, but my understanding is that like you can't really pre-designate custody because it kind of has to be decided in that moment, like what's in the best interest of the child, etc. So my understanding is that's best to consult with an attorney and not just rely on like a power of attorney or notarized letter, which may not be enough. That being said, I think that's better than nothing. If that's all you can do is get like a notarized letter, that's at least something that would hopefully keep, the school from having to call like child services or something like that and having the child end up like in foster care. Planning for elderly family members or family members that have like medical needs. Just having all this information that if you are like kind of plucked out of your life in one fell swoop, like who else has this knowledge and knows where to find these things? Which is really scary to plan for, but like we're seeing it, every single day now. So
I
Thanks.
think you just kind of answered this in the course of that, but I just wanted to confirm that I understood what you're saying there, right? I heard at one point people being kind of more afraid to pursue the next steps in their becoming a citizen, for example. If you've got your 5 years with a green card, the fear of showing up to your appointment because people are being picked up maybe outside of an appointment. But it sounds like you're saying even if there is more enforcement like that, people should be pursuing whatever additional status they can get. Is that right?
yes, like with the caveat that it's all very like case and fact specific and like each person should talk to their lawyer about like their specific case and risk factors and that's my like lawyer answer. But like in general, yes, I think that like if you have a strong, if you have your 5 years of being a legal permanent resident and you can naturalize and you don't have any criminal issues, like if it's a clean case, like I think it's better to pursue that. But I mean, I guess their lawyer would talk with them about like there's a chance you might get detained or there's this or that, like, and they still have to decide. But like we talk about this a lot in terms of like people being afraid to go to immigration court if they're in immigration proceedings because we've been hearing about people getting arrested at court, right? Thankfully in Philly it hasn't been as common. I won't say it hasn't happened, but it hasn't been like as common as it is in certain other courts, like in New York. But I've been telling people like if you can get a lawyer to go with you, that's even better. If you can get someone to accompany you, if you don't have a lawyer yet, that's great. But like even if you have to go alone, like I still think that's less risky than not going because if you go, you could be detained. But you also, if you don't go, you'll get a removal order, and then you're at risk of being detained, and you have a removal order, so you can get deported super quickly. So like it depends on kind of like what the next step is for that person, and what their, specific facts are. But in general, I've been sort of advising people, like I just advised a client recently where I think they qualify for a T visa, but nothing is guaranteed and they're not in proceedings. But I'm like, you're also just walking around undocumented without any protection right now. So like maybe it's better to apply for this thing that you probably qualify for. And again, it ultimately has to be up to them, but
That's
sorry,
so,
that's like it
yeah,
depends,
right,
Larry.
right, right. It depends. Yeah, sure, sure, sure. Two things. So the link that I just shared in the chat to the planning page on Project Libertad's website that Rachel mentioned with emergency planning information also includes lists of immigration attorneys that Rachel and her team have posted. So I wanted to make sure that everybody had access to that because I think for those of us who aren't connected in that world, okay, well, where can we send people to get their questions answered. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, Rachel, so you talked about detention versus removal proceedings. And I think, can you just quickly describe the distinction there for us? That would be helpful.
Yes. So, um, I have to like back up and think like how to actually explain it. In general, when people have contact with immigration authorities, like when they're crossing the border, whether they're an unaccompanied child or a family unit or whatever their situation is, they're generally placed in removal proceedings, which are deportation proceedings, where they basically go before a judge and the government is saying that they should be deported and they have to present some type of defense to that before the immigration judge. So basically, everybody who comes into contact with immigration at the border is put in those proceedings. And most of those people, at least in the past, now really the numbers at the border are very low. But normally people would be like released on their own recognizance to come here to Pennsylvania, where they would then be living in the community and going to immigration court, usually in either Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. To have their case be decided by a judge. So you can be in proceedings like that, either detained or not detained. It's much better to not be detained because the grant rates of the judges tend to be higher. You have a much better chance of getting your case approved or winning your case, whatever that case may be, if you're not in detention. Um, that's always been the case, but especially now because we've been seeing any judge that is like granting too many asylum claims or things that have been being fired and replaced by judges that are appointees of the current government, or like military judges with no immigration experience. I think that's an even like more stark difference now. You also just have more ability to like gather evidence to support your case and work with your lawyer over a longer period of time if you're not in detention. If you're in detention, things are very condensed, they move very quickly, and you're in detention, so it's obviously hard to like help your lawyer gather evidence in your case, and things like that. So.
And when we're talking about, so generally you're talking about applying for asylum or some type of immigration relief. So how, just generally for us, how is that what is that process like? How likely is it for folks to win their case? What are the chances here for folks when they're applying for that type of relief?
Yeah, I mean, like in among like immigration attorneys now, people basically say like asylum is non-existent anymore, right now. The process, I know there's a lot of talk about it being like a loophole or people kind of gaming the system with asylum. But the only way to apply for asylum is to show up in the US and then apply. There's no way to apply from abroad. There's no way to apply in advance. So even though we treat asylum seekers like they're crossing the border illegally, they're actually just like doing the only process that exists for them. There's no like United Nations like refugee type program for people from the Southern Hemisphere, basically, to apply. So they just have to show up, and that's what they're supposed to do. The process can take a really long time. Like I have, and the process is also a little bit different for unaccompanied kids, but I have kids from like 2020 when I first filed their case that still haven't been given an interview to even have their case heard. So they've like literally grown up now, um, and still haven't had a chance to even present their case. And that can also make their claim go like stale, basically. Like have kids who it was like a child abuse claim because their parents were abusing them, and now they're like 23, and it's like, okay, like is that still a good case? And it's not their fault that it's taken this long for, them to get an interview. Um, so in terms of how we prepare, you have to write basically a really long affidavit, which is like their story in their own words of why they're afraid to go back to their country, why they would be harmed, what would happen to them. So it's talking a lot about kind of like the worst things that have ever happened to you, which is obviously really difficult. Even if they get to know me a little, then they have to later do the same thing in an interview with an asylum officer who is probably like not as nice to them as I am when we're practicing it, and asking them like very intrusive questions and taking notes on everything, and like any little inconsistency will get like picked apart, even though they're kids, and it makes sense that they would have inconsistencies, especially with their trauma. So we write all, that affidavit up, and then they basically have to repeat it all verbally in an interview where they're asked lots of questions. It can take 3, 4 hours to do the interview. We also sometimes will get like psychological evaluations to support their case as like additional evidence. Sometimes it can involve getting documents from their home country, like medical or police records if those exist, affidavits or letters of support from like other family members or witnesses. Uh, so it's a pretty rigorous process. They have to really like unearth a lot of their traumas that they've probably never told many people about, if anyone. So yeah, it's a really tough process. And it's even harder. Like, so I'm doing this sort of at the USCIS level because I work mostly with unaccompanied kids. Um, but it's even harder at the immigration judge level when it's an adversarial proceeding and you have like an ICE attorney arguing against them, and there's no right to a court-appointed lawyer for anybody in immigration court. So if they can't afford an attorney, then they have to represent themselves, even children. Probably went off like a different tangent now.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I think the picture is clear that it's an extremely difficult process and really arduous. And I think one of the first things you said really hits the nail on the head that the process that people are going through is the only process that exists to first cross the border, come into the United States, and then apply. There is no other option. And I think that's just one of the huge myths, right? That perpetuates a lot of negative things. So talked a lot about undocumented folks and applying for asylum in that process and other forms of immigration relief. We have some questions here about um, folks who are citizens or their citizenship in the family. And I think it's an important thing to talk about because it feels like no one is safe these days. So, how safe are naturalized citizens, naturalized U.S. citizens? Under what circumstances could the U.S. citizenship of a naturalized U.S. citizen be revoked?
So, I mean, I think traditionally being naturalized was pretty safe, and it was very rare for the government to try to denaturalize someone. I don't do a lot of nats, but actually, I don't do any of it. I don't know. I said I don't do a lot. So it's not my expertise, but I do know that they have created like an office within the government to try to denaturalize more people, and that I think there have been about 400 plus people that they've tried to begin denaturalizing since that office was founded. I think that a lot of them are cases where they're alleging some type of fraud happened in order to obtain either their citizenship or the underlying like benefit that allowed them to apply for citizenship. So I do think it's unfortunately going to become more common. Um, but yeah, I mean, I still think overall it's pretty rare, and I still think naturalizing is a smart thing to do if you can do it because it protects you more. But
Thanks, Rach. And so, related to this, what rights does a minor have with birthright citizenship whose parents have been detained? And who advocates for them?
So, I mean, the sad thing is that really nobody within ICE or the government is advocating for them or looking out for them. So, people who are born in the US, at least right now, are US citizens. That case is at the Supreme Court, and there's a decision expected, I think, in June. So, fingers crossed that they don't undo birthright citizenship, which sounded like a crazy thing to say like a year ago, but here we are. Um, so, I mean, US citizens have the right to be here and live in the US. What often happens is that ICE just arrests a parent without really, unless the child is like with them, not really worrying about if there's a child at home or going to come home from school to be by themselves. And then I think a lot of times the schools end up intervening and helping them either connect with a relative or go into foster care, whatever that looks like. But I don't really like nobody in the government is looking out for them, which is just like the sad truth.
Thanks, Rachel. Um, okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Rob to pull on some questions from the chat. Thanks for those who have asked your questions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our first questions is, do most of your cases originating from Montco end up in Philadelphia? And if so, do the new laws signed by Mayor Parker help the cause at all?
So, hi, Uncle John. John is Mark's uncle, my husband's uncle. Um, so thank you for coming. Um, so anybody who is in removal proceedings, like in our area, would go to the Philadelphia Immigration Court. If you're asking about like people getting detained, what's been happening in general is that they're getting sent to the federal detention center in Philadelphia before being transferred to Moshannon, which is like 4 or 5 hour drive away from here in Phillipsburg. Um, so when someone gets detained, it's important to connect them with like the Philadelphia Defenders as soon as possible because they have a project called the Philly Habeas Project, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier with those federal habeas petitions to try to get people out of detention. And while they're in Philly, we can get them out much more quickly. But if they get moved to Moshannon, it's a different court and is less friendly and not as quick. Um, so I think, is that what you were asking?
I think that's for you, John.
Eh,
Feel free to unmute if you'd like to respond.
There it is.
Mhm.
Hi, guys. Yeah, I was just curious if the laws that Mayor Parker just signed, 6 out of 7, and the seventh one passed without her signature, do they offer some more protection when you do have a cause to go down to Philadelphia on somebody's behalf?
so I think a lot of these like kind of local laws or ordinances about ICE, like I'm not really sure how much teeth they have behind them because of like jurisdiction problems, because like Philadelphia doesn't have jurisdiction over like a federal agency. I think it's really nice like symbolic thing for the city to do. In terms of like reaffirming their commitment to immigrants and being a sanctuary city. But I don't think sanctuary policies really like do as much as people tend to think that they do. Basically, what it means is that like they won't hold somebody for ICE unless there's like a judicial warrant to arrest that person. And oftentimes ICE doesn't have a judicial warrant; they just have like their own made up internal warrant. Um, so I mean, I think it's great that they're doing that and that they're like kind of putting that out there, but I don't know like how much it's really going to impact like how ICE operates in the city, unfortunately.
Yeah, if there's no teeth to it, I just wonder if we've just made Philadelphia higher on the target list.
Yeah, and that's another thing people wonder. Like I know that's why like I live in Phoenixville and I think that's been like a reason why they haven't, even though they are a very welcoming community, like haven't put out a formal sanctuary policy because they want to kind of avoid drawing attention.
So don't expect these surrounding collar counties to do something similar to Philadelphia, I guess.
It depends. I know, like in Montco, I think more of this has happened. And I mean, I go back and forth because, right, like maybe we get a different government locally in a few years that doesn't care about immigrants, and then there's nothing like codified that protects them. So I can kind of see both sides of it. But ultimately, like, yeah, I think ICE is still going to just do what they want to do because they don't feel like they're under the jurisdiction of Philadelphia, and they're not.
Yeah, thank you.
Rachel, a couple of your answers have you've talked about habeas corpus, and I wonder if that's maybe a term that we should briefly just talk about what that means as relates to these
Sure.
cases.
Yeah, so habeas is it's not just used in immigration. It's basically a process where the person who's detained sues the government and says that why they think their detention is unlawful, and you ask a judge to order you released or give you a bond hearing, or whatever it is you're asking for. And it's also used in like the criminal context, when people are because you can't just indefinitely detain someone for no reason. But we've seen people start using this in the immigration context because the traditional way to get out of immigration detention was to get a bond hearing and show that you're not a danger or a flight risk, and have the judge, post the bond that you would pay, and then, um, get out of detention that way. But unfortunately, since they've limited who can get bond, this has been the avenue that people have to pursue.
Another question from the chat is what about TPS beneficiaries from Nicaragua, Haiti, Venezuela, or Syria, and so on? And what other pathway can they take to stay here lawfully and educate their kids?
Yeah, so TPS is something that the government can designate for countries where there are things like wars happening, natural disasters, conditions that like make the country unsafe. It's sort of like DACA in the sense that it's temporary, you have to renew it every couple of years, and it doesn't provide a path to citizenship. Um, so yeah, we've also seen this administration ending TPS for a lot of places where arguably the conditions have not improved to the point where TPS should be ended. Um, and what other pathway they can take is like a very individual question. And that kind of brings us back to my like number one piece of advice, which is that everybody has to talk to a lawyer and get like their case individually assessed. Um, if anybody wants to know like what that process is like, basically when we do a consult with someone, we're asking them lots of questions about their life in their home country, their life in the US, their journey to the US, lots of very intrusive questions about their life to figure out what they might qualify for. Um, and that's what each person with TPS, even if their TPS hasn't been ended yet, really should do, because potentially they qualify for something that's more permanent than TPS. But yeah, that, for some people, there won't be another path. Like they just don't qualify for anything. But it's also possible that they might qualify. And so they really just need that legal consult to figure that out.
I have a question here. It's got some specifics in it. And I'm going to try to talk about it in a general way, and I'm not sure how much advice you can give here. A teacher has a student from Europe preparing to apply for citizenship. She traveled back to her country and stayed longer than 6 months because of a medical emergency, basically. She has documentation from a doctor. Is this a concern? Should she hold off in applying? She still has several years before she needs to renew her permanent residence card.
Yeah, I don't think I know enough to really answer that. It's definitely like I think they just need to talk to their lawyer who would be helping them with the naturalization and ask. I know about like the 6 months, but I don't know if there are like exceptions or if you can make your case that it was like extenuating circumstances. So I would just recommend talking to a lawyer about her situation. Yeah.
So I think, thanks, Rachel. So I think those are most of the questions that we had, and obviously those that folks have submitted. So I'm going to invite people to unmute who are here and ask questions. Please, you can continue to share questions in the chat. But if anybody would like to unmute and ask Rachel a question, go for it.
I've just got a quick one.
Mm.
A lot of this has been like what you need to do is talk to a lawyer directly, right? And I don't know if I have a student or a friend who needs to talk to a lawyer, what is the best way for me to refer someone, especially maybe someone who doesn't have the money to pay for that themselves?
Yes, this is like another thing that really kind of sucks about immigration is that like there's not enough like free or nonprofit lawyers and some people like just have to pay in like the current environment. But especially for students who are like still in high school, like I'm always happy to try to like brainstorm and point people in the right direction if you just like reach out to me directly. We also have those attorney lists on our website. There's also a nonprofit list, so you can refer people to like the nonprofit list if money is an issue. Just like knowing that the nonprofits are all receiving like a ton of referrals and don't have a lot of capacity to take on new cases. There is also an organization in Philly called Equal Access Legal Services, which is like a sliding scale nonprofit law firm. So that is sometimes where I refer people who I think can maybe pay something but can't pay like full private attorney fees. So that can be a good place to start. But like I said, if you want to like reach out to me directly, I'm always happy to like help. But really, I think sometimes it can be helpful just to like help facilitate the appointment. Like even if it's a private attorney, like you can help them call and set up the appointment and make sure they know how to log on to the Zoom or get to the office or whatever it is. So like with some of our like rapid response work where we're connecting families with attorneys a lot, like I've started kind of doing like a warm handoff and like emailing the attorney myself and setting it up just because I feel like the odds of them following through on it are a lot better if I help make the appointment. So even just like that type of facilitation can make a difference.
So that's a really practical thing that those of us who are not immigration attorneys can do, is support people in getting connected.
Hey, Rachel, that email that I sent last week, the article from the Inquirer, is that a real threat, or the nature of it was that the very limited funding to help immigrant kids is now going to be open to for-profit companies? Is that a real thing?
Yeah, so well for one thing they've made a lot of cuts to federal funding for immigration services for unaccompanied kids. And yes, I have heard that. And even with it, with like nonprofits getting that funding, there have been a lot of problems over the years. Like a lot of the facilities that contract with the federal government to like house unaccompanied kids have a lot of issues. And like if you look up, the big one is called Southwest Key. There's like tons of reports of abuse of kids happening in like their shelters, even though they are like a not-for-profit that gets this federal funding to run these programs. So yes, unfortunately, that is a real thing.
Question in the chat. Is there any way to get employment status reinstated if the EAD expires and TPS is still pending?
I don't think so, no, unfortunately. So I have this a lot of times, and they've also recently just reduced like the length of time for work authorization, and then there are huge like processing delays in renewing EADs. So, and this, causes people to lose their jobs if their employer is like really on top of things and knows that it's expired. So I mean, the common like wisdom is to apply 6 months in advance to renew your work authorization. And in the past, there were certain categories, like for asylum seekers, for example, where you got like an automatic 6 month extension if you renewed before it expired, or if you applied to renew it before it expired. But they did it with the automatic extensions also. So, I mean, unfortunately, no. I think a lot of people are in this situation in a lot of different categories. Like DACA is also taking a really long time to be renewed now. So there are people losing their DACA and their work authorization. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a lot of good, not a lot of
No,
answers in
no.
this group
So
tonight.
people are
You
losing
didn't bring me really
status.
good news.
Even people that are following the normal procedures are losing status just because things are taking so long and there are delays, it sounds like. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Other questions that folks would like to ask? I think
Man,
I can ask. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
I've got a quick one. Many
Yep.
of the people here are here through our advocacy committee. Are there any like current pending legislative changes that we should be advocating for? Um, I mean, a lot, but that maybe we don't know about or that are
Yeah,
close
like
to your
where to
work.
start? So one thing that affects a lot of youth is the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status Program. So SIJ is basically a path to a green card for kids who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one of their parents. And without being too boring, you basically have to get a custody order before the child turns 18 in Pennsylvania that says that they were abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent and that it's not in their best interest to go back to their home country. And then you use that order to apply for the status. And if you get that status approved, then there's a long backlog before they can actually apply for their green card. Because there are many, basically, they put this program for some reason under the same category of visas as like employment-based visas. And there's a cap on the number of like green cards that they can process every year for kids in this program because of that. So you have kids who will wait 3, 4, 5 years in between when they get that approval and when they can actually even apply for their green card. And in the meantime, they are really vulnerable because they don't really have any protection. Starting in 2022, they were giving them deferred action, which is basically what DACA is. So it's a temporary protection from deportation and the ability to get work authorization. And that program was ended in June of last year. So now kids are kind of back to being in limbo. There is like litigation going on about that change. Um, but the government just issued a new memo that went into effect on May 10th saying that they're like ending the program, but they're trying to end it like the right way this time so that a court doesn't stop them again. Um, all of that to say, there's this organization called the End SIJS Backlog Coalition, and they do a lot of really good advocacy work on pushing for protections for SIJ kids. Like Congress could pass something that removes this cap on green cards so that kids could just get the green card more quickly. So that's something I would definitely want everyone to advocate for because we have a lot of kids in this situation. We're seeing ICE detain kids who have SIJ or have deferred action through SIJ. So not really showing any respect for this determination to give them deferred action that like another branch of the government has made. Um, And also there are kids who have been, I think there were like 260 some kids who have been removed from the US, deported from the US, who have SIJ. Whether that's because they had an old removal order that they didn't know about, or because the judge did. There's also a recent appellate court decision that said that judges for immigration removal proceedings should not like wait for kids to get their green card. They should proceed with removal proceedings and not give continuances for kids to be able to wait out the backlog for their green cards. So a lot of these things are kind of like coalescing to make things really hard for SIJ kids who have been given this like protection that Congress created for them. So it's called, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if I got the right one. Check the chat, Rach.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
it's,
that's it.
is that
Yeah.
right? Okay,
Yeah, they have a lot of good, they have
good.
resources like for youth, but also for like community members. Just
Amazing. Thank you. Cheryl, yes, I see your hand is up.
Hi. Hey, Val, how you doing? And hi,
Good to
Rachel.
see you.
hi.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I do have a question. Jenny Bear and I are in Lancaster and Lebanon counties, and with Church World Service, having resettled a lot of people through the CHMB humanitarian Poli program, we have a lot of students that, came here and very abruptly lost their temporary protected status, lost their work papers, and are, in varying stages of applying for asylum. And I'm curious, like, what are you hearing? Like, what is happening in those cases? Have any like we don't know what the likelihood of people getting approved for that is. I think there's a lot of anxiety here with, um many of the folks here who resettled here. So I was just curious what you've been hearing. Has it been tested?
Yeah, so for people who entered like through CBP1, through that program, um, I think there is litigation going on about the ending of that like period of parole because they were granted parole for a certain amount of time, and then it was abruptly taken away. So I would pay attention to like court cases about that to see if anything changes. But I would also point out that like parole was always temporary. Even if their parole wasn't ended early, which of course it shouldn't have been, like parole is not a permanent status. So they, no matter what, were gonna have to figure out like another step if they were gonna try to stay in the US. Um, I do believe that getting paroled in through that program is like a lawful entry for purposes of like adjusting their status through a family member because you have to have a legal entry to be able to do that. So if they have a relative who is a green card holder or a US citizen, they should have that option because they did have a lawful entry. But there are lots of types of immigration status that those folks might qualify for. It could be asylum, it could be special immigrant juvenile status, it could be a U visa, a T visa, which are for victims of crime and trafficking. So again, they have to talk to a lawyer. I'm sorry, I just like keep saying that. But like individually, yeah, they were all gonna have to figure out at some point like what they qualified for other than parole because that ends. And I mean you can sometimes renew it, but like yeah, it's always intended to be a temporary thing. And that's really like an individual decision depending on like their situation and their facts, of what they might qualify for afterward, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that question, Cheryl. I think oftentimes with these temporary statuses and parole statuses, people establish lives and they get going and they, put down roots. And it's really hard to have to think about, the kind of the next step, like you said, um, knowing that that's temporary. But that feels tough. But like you said, it's no matter what, that was always going to have to be in the plan anyway. John.
Uh, Any news on any changes with regard to the SIV, the visas for Afghans, even if they've already received their green card? uh, Whether they were talking about revetting them. Any news on any changes with that?
I actually don't know much about that, so I can't answer that one. I do know that they were revetting a lot of refugees, in general, though.
Do you have suggestions, Rachel, on best resources for getting information on that? Or
Let me
again,
look and I'll email you something, Belle. I'm
oh
not sure.
yeah, that'd be great. Okay, thanks. John, if you want to put your email in the chat, we can, if you want that information, we can follow up with you with what Rachel shares. So I'm gonna pull this from the chat. No, it's great. Sorry to ask you to reiterate, but want to confirm. If a student's guardians are detained, regardless of the student's immigration status, we should, number one, contact extended family, and if none, number two, contact CPS. Is that correct? Also, and then there's a second part to it, but I'll stop there.
So, I mean, I think this might actually be like a question for your school district, like on what they want you to do in this scenario. I would say I always prefer if it's safe for kids to be with their extended family, versus going into CPS care. But I think this is actually more of a question of like what your school's policy is on it. When I've seen this happen here where I live, they've thankfully had like an aunt or an uncle or somebody else like kind of in the area that was able to step up. So it hasn't come to like having to call CPS, thankfully. But yeah, and this is why I think it's really important for families to put somebody else as like an emergency contact who's allowed to communicate with the school and all of that in the event that something like this happens unexpectedly. I don't know, like I know schools aren't allowed to ask about immigration status, but I don't know if you're allowed to like follow up and be like, hey, you don't have a secondary contact on here. Like, so maybe that's something to explore with your school to kind of be prepared. But
Great point. Yeah, that's helpful. If a student is detained, are there any specific legal resources for immigrant youth? For context, I'm in Delaware, and people detained here are often transferred to either Philly or Baltimore.
okay, so if someone is detained and they're an adult, like even if they're a student but they're over 18, they'll still be treated like an adult, like in immigration detention. So like we were talking about habeas petitions earlier, which are like one of the best ways or the only ways right now really to get people out of detention. Um, and so it will be really important while they're still in the Philly area, to get them in touch with the habeas project that I was mentioning. I'm going to put the email for that in the chat right now. So it's PIFUP at philadefender.org. And so the Defenders and Villanova and Highest Pennsylvania and some other orgs like all collaborate on this project. And it's important to get the person, basically all they need is like a phone number and contact for somebody like on the outside of detention who knows the person and can provide information. They also will go into the detention center in Philadelphia and like visit people and get the information they need, if they can't get it from their contact. But it's important to get that to them literally as soon as you can because they're moving people really, really quickly. But if they were to move the person to Baltimore or to Moshannon or wherever it is, and they filed in Philadelphia, their case will stay in Philadelphia, like in the jurisdiction of that court. And those judges have been a lot better about like getting people out within a couple of days in a lot of cases. So that's like the number one thing I would do if a student was detained and they're an adult. If they're a minor, there's like a couple of things that could be happening. If they're a minor and they're detained with their parent, they're probably going to like a family detention center like Dilley that we were talking about earlier in Texas, because there's only certain facilities where they're allowed to house like adults with children. And the rest of the ICE detention facilities are just adults. And if they're a child who's detained alone, then they would be getting put into the unaccompanied minor system, which is under like Health and Human Services. And in that case, then like a sponsor has to jump through all kinds of hoops to get them out of detention, like different background checks and things. And they've made it a lot more difficult, which has made kids spend a lot more time in detention because they're targeting sponsors like for ICE enforcement, who are undocumented, and they're asking for a lot more to be able to get someone out than what they used to. In terms of like immigration, like lawyer resources, we do have the attorney lists on our website. So I'm always happy to brainstorm. If I can help and you want to reach out to me directly, I think Val put my email in the chat earlier and she can maybe send it out. Can you send it out to everyone in here?
If you're okay with it, I absolutely will.
On our website, and they're gonna find it. No, yeah, you can also just go to our website, and basically everything on there will come to me anyway. But we're always happy to help try to brainstorm if we can figure out like how to direct you best.
Yeah, the great questions. So I am going to invite one final question, if there is one, before we close out. If there are any burning questions. Okay. It is 6:01. I want to thank you all for joining us on a Monday evening. This has been recorded, so we're going to be sharing it on our Penn T Cell East YouTube channel. Rob, I don't know if you'd mind dropping the YouTube channel link in the chat. Again, Rachel's email is in the chat. She has invited you to reach out, so please do. We want to thank you for joining us. And yeah, Rachel, thanks for being our first speaker for our very first AMA. We appreciate it.